There's a well-known folk song written at the beginning of the 19th century which tells of a Birmingham man returning home after an absence of 20 years, who laments that every place is altered so, it fills my heart with grief and woe because I can't find Brummagem. Well, I'm not quite a Brummie. I was born across the border in Solihull, but I spent my childhood here 20 years ago, and now I've come back to rediscover the city on its 100th birthday. When that folk songwriter came back here, it was still a market town. And yet only a few years later, the phrase "Made in Birmingham" was known throughout the world. The city's motto is "Forward," and over the years, most other British cities owe something to ideas pioneered here. There have been mistakes too, but what is never in question is the resilience of the place, its ability to improve, to change, to roll with the punches. This, the character of the people, is the key to Birmingham's history. Birmingham, the town of 1,000 trades, the workshop of the world, the industrial community at the heart of England, became a city on the 14th of January 1889. It was no real surprise that only a year later an American journalist was describing Birmingham as the best governed city in the world. For city status, bringing with it not only a coat of arms but national recognition of the borough, was the icing on a multi-layered corporation cake that had been in the baking for at least the previous 50 years. The main ingredient of this successful recipe for local government was the civic gospel, promoted by nonconformist preachers like George Dawson. The message was that men of influence had a spiritual duty to work for the good of their people.
Dawson believed that in many ways the municipality, the corporation, was like a church because it had the same sort of God-given responsibilities as the church. So, Sunday after Sunday, from the Church of the Saviour, he insisted that the many problems and difficulties which had resulted from the over-rapid population growth simply had to be tackled. A great town, he declared, was a solemn organism, and its civic leaders had a sacred duty to systematically improve the lot of all the town's citizens, and particularly the poorest.
The civic gospel seems a long way off these days, and Dawson's statue fairly skulks in its bushes behind the council house. The Church of the Saviour, where he preached, has been bulldozed to a waste-ground car park, and his reforming ideals have been submerged in personal, committee and party politics. As for today's citizens, the majority, it must be said, seem totally unconcerned with the past. This isn't a modern trend. Indeed, commentators on the town from the 16th century onwards have recognised the special character of the Brummie.
These folk never have a minute to themselves. They work as if they must get rich in the evening and die the next day. One only sees busy people and faces brown with smoke.
The streets were thronged with working people. The hum of labour resounded from every house. Lights gleamed from the long casement windows in the attic stories, and the whirl of wheels and the noise of machinery shook the trembling walls.
A honeycomb of artisans in a hive of hovels. Every man jack for himself, and the devil take the hindmost. Hundreds, thousands of them. Smiths, chainmakers, brass founders, cutlers, bit, buckle and button makers. A big town of little men.
I was surprised at the place, but more so at the people. They presented a vivacity I'd never before beheld. I had been among dreamers, but now I saw men awake. Their very step along the street showed alacrity.
Do they mean us? They certainly do, and it was near here, where the River Ray now runs under Floodgate Street, that markets were held around the important river crossing of the Birmingham Plateau. Cloth and later metal trades grew up, fueled by abundant water power, and as transport improved, the market town became an industrial centre. It was the importance of the market and the marketplace that changed what was just another Anglo-Saxon hamlet into one of the major industrial centres of modern Europe. And yet Birmingham wouldn't have developed much beyond a market town without the shrewdness of its first documented entrepreneur, Peter de Birmingham. Between 1154 and 1166, he acquired the rights to hold a weekly market here, the first market charter for the whole of the West Midlands area. This allowed him to collect tolls on the no doubt profitable trade that had built up at the only safe crossing of the River Ray, coincidentally at the junction of 3 counties.
Right from the gaining of the market charter, the local lord of the manor was obviously interested in improving trade in the area. And then as we move into the real growth, the 16th and 17th centuries, there were large landed estates quite close to the town that were broken up to form units, industrial estates, housing estates, and there are development plans from the 18th century which actually show all the vacant plots, and they produce these so that anybody considering moving to the area, rather as is done today for a new town, could see just what was available.
There were many incentives for manufacturers wanting to move to Birmingham. There were no restrictive guild practices in the established trades. There were ample supplies of iron and coal nearby in the Black Country. Birmingham had always been at the heart of England's communication network and became crucially so in the mid-18th century with the development of the inland waterway.
The canals really came about because of the poor road system at the time. It was affecting the industrial growth of Birmingham, which was quite rapid. And the first canal, the first section of the Birmingham Canal, in fact, was developed in about 1769, and it had a tremendous impact on industrial growth, particularly because it meant that raw materials could be brought into Birmingham much cheaper. The price of coal, in fact, was halved. But in fact, James Brindley had the idea of expanding the whole canal system, putting Birmingham at the centre, and the idea of the Silver Cross was developed, which meant that estuaries from the Humber, Mersey, Thames and Severn all joined together with Birmingham virtually in the centre.
In the next 50 years, the growth of the canal network was staggering. A shortened route to Bristol was the last to be established, with the completion of the Worcester and Birmingham Canal in 1815. It had nearly 60 locks and extensive tunnelling to connect Birmingham with the River Severn at Worcester. A direct route to London had come with the completion of a link to the Grand Union in 1799. And 20 years before that, the Grand Trunk Canal had been driven through the Black Country to the ports of Liverpool and Hull. Birmingham's businessmen were quick to recognise the advantages of this cheaper transport. Wharves and canal basins sprang up throughout the town, and from the end of the 18th century, narrowboats were trading with all Britain's major ports, so realising Brindley's dream. It was against this background of the silver cross of national canals that Edmund Burke first described Birmingham as the toy shop of the world in 1777. Here they made everything from jewellery to guns, from pens to swords, from buckles to buttons. The key to this expansion was power. Sarehole Mill was one of a score of water mills set up along Birmingham's rivers, originally to grind corn. As the mills changed over to more industrial uses, the 6-year ownership of Sarehole by local manufacturer Matthew Bolton taught him valuable lessons in the unreliability of natural power that were to pay dividends later. For it was the harnessing of steam power, fuelled by cheap Black Country coal, stoked by Matthew Bolton's partnership with the engineer James Watt, that was to revolutionise Birmingham's industry. Several of his pumping engines had been installed in the Midlands by the late 1770s. Among the first half dozen was this, built to pump water for the Birmingham Canal Navigation Company in Smethwick. Bolton quickly realised the potential of engines that would turn machinery, and though he's remembered as part of the Murdoch, Bolton and Watt trio, it was his partnership with Watt that was special.
I think this was the coming together of two men who exactly complemented each other. Matthew Bolton was the local man with tremendous business skill, with contacts to raise the finance. James Watt was a canny Scotsman, an engineer, a man with contact with science, but a man who needed pushing. He would not, I think, have got anywhere near as many of his inventions into production without a businessman behind him.
With the setting up of a proof house for Birmingham's gunsmiths, with the Silver Cross of Canals established and a local assay office, Birmingham could swap the title Toy Shop of Europe to that of Workshop of the World, with an unrivaled tradition of skilled craftsmanship.
I'm a jolly roving blade, and they call me Jack of all trades. They always fix me chief delight in kissing of the fair maid. To Birmingham I did set out to seek a situation. Often heard folks say it was the toy shop of the nation. In Smallbrook Street made candlesticks, in Worcester Street a broker, in Floodgate Street made fire irons and shovel tongs and poker. In Ann Street was a dialist, New Hall Street a guy sinker. In New Street drove a hackney coach, in Moore Street was a printer. In Walmoreland Street trusses made Litchfield Street a sad shop. In Stewhouse Lane made snuffers, and in Bell Street kept a rag shop. Church Street was a silversmith, in Livery Street made split rings. In Charles Street a clockmaker, and all such little odd things. I'm a roving jack of all trades, of every trade and all trades. And if you want to know me name, call me Jack of all trades.
It's often been argued that in this period there really wasn't all that much in the way of distance between masters and men, that the hard-working craftsman, hard-working artisan could put a bit by and could become a small master. And similarly, the small master who fell on evil times or whose order book became empty might well find himself having to earn his living again as an artisan. But I don't think we should have too rosy a view of what Birmingham was like in that time. On the one hand, there certainly was conflict between masters and men. They didn't always agree by any means on political or economic affairs. There were strikes, there were trade unions, even in the period when trade unions were, on the face of it, very strictly banned by law. Also, the comparative prosperity of Birmingham working men was made possible by really quite appalling conditions for others in the Birmingham workforce. The women of Birmingham were a very important contribution to the development of the Industrial Revolution, of industrialisation of Birmingham. They, on the whole, worked at extremely low paid, sometimes dangerous, dirty and very unpleasant jobs. Also, there was quite a large and growing Irish workforce in Birmingham, which, as in other parts of the country, tended often to do the dirtier and less satisfactory jobs.
It was the coming of the railways that employed many of that Irish workforce. Birmingham's first train arriving on the 4th of July 1837 from Liverpool.
I think the railway was the replacement for the canals and the stagecoach, really, and it enabled the cheaper transportation of goods and then the cheaper transportation of people.
To accommodate the new arrivals, a great swathe of Birmingham was flattened and a new terminus erected.
It must have been described almost as a sort of cathedral, because if you can imagine how beautifully clean it was in those days, with all that lovely glass roof and all that beautiful Victorian scroll work and cast iron work. And when it was kept clean, and it certainly must have been kept clean in those days, as you can see from those lovely illustrations in the old magazines, it must have been something really to go and have a look at.
The iron cross of railways made it easier for firms to export goods and to move their factories out of the cramped city centre. Of all the city's trades, Birmingham's gunsmiths were most prone to the whims of international politics, and it's not surprising that when threatened, they were prepared to take the risk and move out of the town to a site bordered by the railway.
The gun trade in Birmingham had been established for close on 200 years, but it was very much a craft trade. It was individuals working at benches, and by the 1860s, they were having competition from America, where large American factories were being established to make guns in factory conditions, to mass produce them on machines so that they had interchangeable parts. And in 1861, something like 20 Birmingham gun makers got together to set up a factory to compete with the Americans and to make guns in a factory using factory machinery.
Rapid expansion brought its problems, and the population rose threefold in half a century. Older parts of the town became congested as new industry mushroomed without any control. It was the voteless workers that suffered.
In the central slums of Birmingham, you had a population density of about 500 persons per acre. That's equivalent to 750 people camping on one football pitch. And as in camping, there was no tapped water, there were no toilets, apart from buckets and holes in the ground. And 1 in every 25 children in the 1870s was overlaid by its parents, suffocated during the night by its parents. And then infantile diarrhea and whooping cough carried off large numbers of under ones and 1-year-olds. Measles concentrated on the 1s and the 2s. And if children escaped that, then they stood a good chance of being clobbered later on by smallpox or scarlet fever, which were the really bad diseases among the older children. And just to make things absolutely impossible, the prevailing social philosophy of the time was laissez-faire, leave things alone.
The American who described Birmingham as the best governed city in the world had also recognized that it was a business city run on business lines. Indeed, it was not just a businessman, but a salesman who emerged to push through the greatest corporation achievements of the closing years of the 19th century. Joseph Chamberlain had come to Birmingham to work for his uncle Joseph Nettleton, a screw manufacturer. He married into prominent nonconformist families, became enthused by the civic gospel of social reform preached by George Dawson and the movement for educational reform proposed by the Reverend Robert Dale. Under their influence in his 3 years as mayor, Chamberlain was to alter the face of Birmingham for all time. Birmingham's last gas lamp was removed exactly 100 years after Chamberlain had persuaded the council to take over a handful of privately owned gas companies and use the profits to relieve the rates. Gaslight had arrived in Birmingham under the mantle of William Murdoch, who had illuminated his colleague Matthew Bolton's Soho works as a great advertisement of the power of gaslighting as early as 1802. Gas for street lighting was picked up first by London and didn't reappear in Birmingham for another 16 years. But with several companies laying mains, selling gas and trying to maintain equipment, the service was patchy, inefficient and costly. Under municipal control, with Chamberlain, the wizard of the gas, at the head of the gas committee, the service was rationalised and the price gradually brought down by a cumulative 30% to the consumer. The municipalisation of water, on the other hand, was promoted largely on grounds of health, and the arguments leading to the city's eventual purchase of the Elan Valley in Wales were impossible to fault when most of the city's wells were contaminated. Any water that was available was so foul it was little better than sewage, so much so that the poor were forced to steal water from the waterworks company's taps. But gas and water were nothing compared with Chamberlain's final campaign for city improvement. Here again, though, lack of money was a major problem.
Chamberlain cut through that problem. He said, apart from municipalising gas, which helped, he said we will borrow the money. And he cajoled and bullied and it was that really, he cajoled and bullied the town council into borrowing £5 million in the space of 3 years. That's equivalent to about 250 million pounds today. And you have to see it against the context of the 1860s, when the average rate raised about £100,000. So he got hold of this vast sum of money by introducing the borrowing technique, in a sense, and that's what enabled him to finance the whole improvement scheme. And of course, it was this idea, plus Dawson's doctrine, that was adopted in all the other towns across the land. I mean, Chamberlain showed the country, really, how to run a civic authority by borrowing money.
The Great Improvement Scheme was based on a mighty new road, known appropriately as Corporation Street. It was sold to the council as a slum clearance scheme under the Artisans' Dwellings Act, and mostly completed by 1889. Corporation Street is not that different 100 years on, particularly above shop front level. Back at the turn of the century, this Parisian-style boulevard with its plate glass windows and fashionable shops soon eclipsed New Street as the premier street in the city. Demolition had begun in August 1878, and building work went on for more than 20 years, replacing a former area of slums with hotels, shops, the county court, and the Great Western Arcade. That was financed by a consortium, the first of Birmingham's arcades, built in 1875 on top of the 600-yard railway tunnel from Snow Hill Station. 5 years later, it was continued by way of the now modernised Northwestern Arcade to join Corporation Street. The local papers were suitably impressed. "Birmingham seems to be getting quite an Arcadian town," wrote the Mail, not perhaps in the sense of primitive innocence and pastoral simplicity, but in the number and magnificence of its arcades. The last quarter of the 19th century saw town improvements of all kinds. Curious passers-by watched the laying of telephone wires to offices in the business quarter. The River Ray was culverted to prevent the danger of flooding. New Street's Christ Church was knocked down and carted away to make room for Victoria Square. And everywhere, roads were dug up for Birmingham's new tram lines. The opening of Aston Park by youthful Queen Victoria and the days when dinosaurs ruled the earth were just two of the tableaus in Birmingham's Charter Centenary celebrations of 1938. In the 15 years after the granting of that charter, a dinosaur mentality had blocked any significant progress towards social reform in the council chamber, and battle royal was fought between the rival economist and progressive parties. But largely because of the charisma and energy of Chamberlain and the Dawsonite civic gospel, this futile wrangling didn't last forever. With a new spirit of enterprise, the corporation began to make up for the lost years. So by the time of the first performance of Elgar's Dream of Gerontius at the 1901 Triennial Festival at the Town Hall, the overcrowded market town of the 1838 Charter had been transformed into one of the country's most progressive and dynamic Victorian cities.
Victorian Birmingham was sheer hell. For the majority of people, it was nobody's fault, but in terms of environmental condition, that's the only thing you can call it, sheer hell. And by the time you get to the 1870s, people are beginning to feel, compared with what we had a generation ago, this is heaven. And that's what is expressed in this grandiloquent, church-like, high Victorian architecture. It's the architecture of pride, of achievement, of thanksgiving. For a brief interlude, during the economic boom of the 1870s particularly, with the profits of empire and the consciences of the well-to-do at last really beginning to improve the lot of Birmingham's poorest citizens, you really did have some sense of the New Jerusalem. And indeed, fittingly, it's at that time that you even find the ornate, over-earnest Victorian architecture in the working class houses themselves, because you can still find in Birmingham little terraces of what were originally 5 shilling a week houses, little terraces of these houses with Romanesque doorways and pointed Gothic windows. And this grandiose architecture got right down to the lower levels of society by that time.
Victorian Gothic also finds its expression in the school buildings which survive from this period, built to satisfy the demands of state education acts. Birmingham had to find 20,000 places to supplement the existing denominational and private schools. Chamberlain had always been a champion of free education, and under his and later George Dixon's chairmanship, the Birmingham School Board not only found 30,000 places, but provided a set of schools unrivalled in the country. Attendance was compulsory, with parents under legal obligation to have their children instructed. As for the curriculum, the 3 R's formed the basic content, with grammar, history and geography also taught. At the same time, the beginnings of a welfare policy could be seen, with free meals and health services for poorer children. As early as 1891, fees were abolished. Arrangements were made for backward children who were taught in special classes. A fine record, but although the 1876 bylaws had got rid of the worst of the jerry-built housing, the city fathers hadn't come to grips with the main problems facing the new industrial towns throughout the land. The rehousing of the inner city slum dwellers, the relocation of industry outside the city centre, and the acquisition of land on which to do it. The necessary impetus was to come from other quarters. In 1879, George Cadbury, a prominent Quaker, had moved his chocolate works 4 miles out of the city. In 1895, he began to build the first houses of an estate that was to make the name Bourneville as famous as his chocolate. Then, in 1906, Herbert Austin bought a derelict printing works at Longbridge and began making motor cars. Victorian Birmingham had entered the modern age.